We've been talking about Abram, who became Abraham. In the book of Genesis, chapter 15, we read, "The Lord made a covenant with Abram." Now we are going to look more closely at why that's important. Let's start to think about covenant by talking about a contract. Let's say I agree to clean your garage and you tell me that you pay me $30, and I say that that's a fair price for the work that needs to be done. So we sign a paper that says that I will clean the garage and that you will pay me $30, and that agreement is called a contract. If I have a contract like that, there are conditions. The condition that I have to complete is cleaning your garage. The condition that you have to complete is paying me $30. If I do not complete my condition, then you are not expected to complete yours. If I do not clean the garage, you're not expected to pay me the $30. We might think that there are some similarities between a contract and the kind of covenant that we read about in Abraham's story. But the two things are not as similar as we might think at first. God makes some pretty major promises to Abraham. God tells Abraham that he will bless him with descendants, give a land for his descendants. And God tells him that all the world will be blessed through his family. These are promises that God will complete or fulfill. What is Abraham supposed to do as his condition? What is it that if Abraham doesn't do it, then God will not fulfill his promises? Well, Abraham's primary role in this covenant was not to meet conditions, but to trust God. Abraham needed to trust that God will fulfill his promises. Promises are different than conditions. Trust or faith is also different than a condition. There's a big difference between this covenant relationship and a contract. The covenant that God made with Abraham looks like many other covenants from the ancient world that Abraham lived in. These covenants are common in the Bible. In a couple of weeks, we'll read about Jacob, who was coming back to his family's land after fleeing from his brother Esau years before. As he was leaving his father-in-law's land, as he was sneaking away actually, his father-in-law caught up to him, and the two of them made a covenant. Jonathan made a covenant with David. The blood covenant was commonly known in the ancient times and cultures in which Abram lived. So when God wanted to communicate to Abraham, he used the covenant because it was a relationship that people would already understand. The closest thing to an ancient covenant that we know today is marriage. In marriage, we often say that two people become one. What does that mean? It's a hard question to answer, but often when people get married, you start hearing their names together a lot of the time. Instead of hearing about Carl or about Julia, people talk about Carl and Julia. It's like Carl's identity and Julia's have become combined in some ways. Carl's not just Carl anymore. He's Julia's husband. Julia's not just Julia anymore. She's Carl's wife. They probably even share the same checking account and credit cards. We also expect it to be permanent, even if we know that all marriages don't prove to be. The covenant is like that. It's an only death will dissolve this kind of relationship. In a covenant, there's a melding of identity and resources and more. A covenant is made with a ceremony that represents what is happening. A little bit like a wedding ceremony. In the blood covenant ceremony, there was a sacrifice. The blood symbolized entering into a type of death to self, and also passing through to a new life of union together with the covenant partner. The covenant partners walked between the two halves of the cut sacrifice. The ceremony included a mark placed on the body of each participant, such as a scar on the wrist. It also included a covenant meal. In this ceremony, there are several exchanges that represent the new relationship. There's an exchange of robes, of belts, of weapons, of names, and of sons. An exchange of robes represented an exchange of identity. If you see me coming in someone else's coat, you might mistake me for that person. The coat is a way to identify someone. The belt in that day is where your military gear was hung. An exchange of belts represented an exchange of strengths or assets. What my covenant partner has is now mine, and what I have is now my covenant partner's. Our resources are combined. The exchange of weapons represents an exchange of enemies. My covenant partner's enemies are now mine, and my enemies are now my covenant partner's enemies. The covenant partners would also exchange part of their names. One thing this would do would be that enemies would know that if they started a fight with one covenant partner, they would be starting a fight with both. Some part of each covenant partner's name would be placed in the name of the other covenant partner. Finally, tradition stated that in order to seal the agreement, to prove the covenant was for real, the two covenant partners would exchange oldest sons. The sons would actually move into the home of the partner to be raised. It was a painful event, but one that would prove the covenant was for real. You might have already noticed some of the parts of the covenant-making ceremony in God's covenant with Abraham. In fact, some of these details might have sounded strange to you before you thought about them as part of making a covenant. God told Abram to get several sacrificial animals, and Abram cut them in half, arranging them for the walk of death, where you walk into death to self and into a new life of covenant unity. Interestingly, in this case, Abram fell asleep, but he saw God pass through the sacrificial animals twice. God was represented in a smoking fire pot and in a flaming torch. So God did the walk of death, taking on his responsibilities in the covenant, and then God passed through again when usually the other covenant partner would have, when Abraham usually would have. So God took on the full responsibility for the covenant. Abraham and his sons all received circumcision as a mark on the body, a mark of the covenant relationship. In this covenant, Abram's name was changed to Abraham, and Sarai's name was changed to Sarah. The from Yahweh was added to each of their names. God was willing to be known after that as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Those are Abraham and his descendants. Abraham had to give his son Isaac to God. He took Isaac up the mountain to sacrifice him, but then God provided an alternative sacrifice. So what does it mean that God came to Abraham and told him he would make a covenant with him? Let's look at the biblical story itself. There are some parallels to stories that we've already been through in the Bible. God made things good, and God made human beings in his image. They were supposed to govern creation as God's special representatives. They were to represent God's character and ways and reveal to the rest of creation what God is like. They did not trust God, but instead trusted the serpent, thinking that maybe the life that he was offering was better than the one God had given them. They missed the aim that God set for them, the intent that God had for him. They did not live in the image of God in which they were created. They did not govern creation in godly ways. Instead, creation spiraled into corruption. But God was at work to make things new and good. God rescued Noah's family as he destroyed the corrupt creation. God gave Noah's family the same intent that he'd given humanity: govern over creation, be fruitful, filling the earth with God's goodness. But Noah's descendants did not fill the world with goodness. From out of humanity, God called to Abram. God told Abram to go to a land that he would show him, promised that Abram would have many descendants, and said that the whole world would be blessed through Abram's family. To be given a land to possess is, in a way, to be told to govern over that piece of creation. To have many descendants is to be fruitful and multiply. That the world will be blessed through Abram's descendants is to fill the earth with God's blessing and image. Abraham's descendants were the covenant people of God. They were made to share in God's identity. They were his special representatives. The promises given to Abraham were not just nice things for Abraham. They were related to God's intent to partner with people in governing the world in ways that reflect or image God himself. The world should have learned what God is like through Abram's descendants. Sometimes this is what happened. Far too often, the world got a bad picture of God from his chosen representatives. Eventually, Jesus will be part of Abraham's descendants, truly showing us what God is like, working God's new creation and bringing blessing to all the world. In our story, Abram was old and did not have any children, even though God had promised him many descendants. Abram asked God how he would know that God would keep these promises. God told him to get several sacrificial animals. God assured Abram of his long-suffering faithfulness by telling him that he would covenant with him and with his descendants. If God works in this kind of way, then your life and mine are very important. It's not that they are this important because of all the great things we have done, or because of all the things that we can do really well. Our lives are important because God has said that he intends for you and for me to represent him. This might seem like a crazy thing for us to think about doing and being, a representative of God, but the biblical story shows us that God works in this way. So, what we need to do is to decide to set representing God as our main goal in life, and to trust God as we do that each day. In order to do that, we should remember who God is and what God is like. So what does it mean to represent God? What does it mean for us to be a part of how God is making all things new? What does it mean for us to reveal God to others? Parents, that question might seem too hard. But if this is what the Bible tells us that God wants us to be and to do, then it's one that we have to find answers for. This is a question that we'll ask over and over. We need to know that most of all, it means acting like God. In the next 2 weeks, we'll look at truthfulness and at forgiveness as two ways that we should act like God. Now, sometimes I set rules for my kids. I know kids must think that parents love to make rules, but I'm usually disappointed when I have to make them. What I want is for my kids to think of what is best, or what will accomplish the goals that we've set, or what to do because it's right. Not because Daddy said they had to. Another way of saying this is that I want my kids to trust that the character that we're trying to instill and the goals that we set are really good for them. These things are not just add-ons to a good life or necessary limitations to their happiness. Rules are something that we have to set because we don't trust that the life that we've been told is good is really good, and we have to find some motivation to point us in the right direction. But if we trust that the life that we've been told is good, and we pursue it, then rules aren't the first thing that we think about. Conditions aren't the first thing that we think about. We think about our identity. We think about the calling that we've been given. What does God's covenant with Abraham tell us about God? Abram questioned whether God would or even could fulfill his promises. When God answered Abram by making a covenant with him, we learned some things about who God is. Here are some covenant words from a book about the covenant that I've used to help shape today's message. These words tell us about a God who makes covenants. Kindness, mercy, peace, steadfast, faithfulness, loyalty, friendship. Look at each word. Each one can be part of your everyday life. How can you live out each word? What does kindness look like today for you? When you need to choose to live out each word, how does it help to think that each word describes God? If you need to live out peace today, how does it help that God is peace? If you need to live out friendship today, how does it help to know that God is a friend? If God wants you to be like him, and God calls us to the kind of covenant where God is with us, and we have access to God's resources, then can we do what God wants us to do? God will fulfill his promises.